Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and I welcome all of you back to another Chris Chan Cwiki reading for 2024, and we move straight into sort of a bit more of a broader topic for what we're concerned, but there's quite a lot of things that I kind of wanted to discuss, and that is concerning Chris and his overall personality. This one is going to be more about just who is Chris, or rather, what is he like, both online and in real life, which, if you've never heard of Christian Western Chandler before, how did you even find this video? But for the rest involved, we'll get straight to the point, shall we? Health disclosure. This article contains in-depth discussion of Chris's physical and or mental health. This page is not to be construed as a substitute for medical advice or a professional diagnosis. All diagnoses are either taken from outside documentation or based on amateur analysis. One's personality is a set of mental, emotional, and behavioral qualities that make up an individual's character. Studying personality is a key aspect of psychology, allowing experts to know what makes people the way they are. There are many methods for testing one's personality, with some baked by decades of scientific research and others created by random people on Facebook to show ads. Chris's personality is quite eclectic. It is what draws countless people around the globe to study and follow his antics. He has spoken quite a bit on his own idea of his personality, but his own insight doesn't always jibe with reality. His personality has undergone quite the change since Bob's death, with some traits undergoing a full 180. Disclaimer. Personality testing is a controversial field, with tests used universally within the scientific community. Even the famous Myers-Briggs test, while useful for rough workplace assessments, is somewhat vague. It misses key areas like creativity and openness, and people who take the test often get different results over time. The closest thing to a gold standard is the Big Five or Ocean test. This article discusses various aspects of Chris's personality, but is not to be taken as a substitute for an actual psych evaluation. Which would be pretty interesting, because, to be honest, do you think I should do the Briggs or the Ocean test? I mean, if we just open this up just for 1 second. What's your personality type? Use the questions on the outside of the chart to determine the 4 letters of your Myers-Briggs type. For each pair of letters, choose the side that seems most natural to you, even if you don't agree with every description. So, I might possibly keep this open for the, maybe to do something later with this. It'd be pretty interesting to work out exactly if there's what can be said about this, but we'll see what it's like some other time, shall we? Anyway, that's the disclaimers over. So that's more we do that. We really just go through them without like any hyperbole, so we can actually get to the things that we can sort of speculate and comment on. Introversion versus extroversion. Chris has described himself as being introverted and extroverted. He has shown traits of both introversion and extroversion over the years. It should be noted that few people are 100% introverted or extroverted. Very much true. It is more akin to a spectrum which people fall on. People can also react differently to different contexts, such as casual one-on-one hangout versus a large crowd. In high school, Chris appears to have been fairly introverted, though he had a strong drive to be extroverted and outgoing. A leaked icebreaker worksheet shows that Chris only talked to 7 of his classmates, and they were all female. Despite trying to later hold a high school reunion in the Song of Christian, a 16-year-old Chris describes having few friends and how his loneliness is off the scale, even with the social prestige of being a water boy to the school's basketball team and his gal pals. Chris took his mom to the high school prom. Nearly 10 years after the prom, Chris talked about feeling like an outcast at the prom, However, his highlight of the evening was when one of his gal pals felt sorry for him and pulled him onto the dance floor. This dance felt like hours to Chris. So, almost immediately you could argue very much the case that whether or not Chris is 100% sincere about his loneliness I would say it's more often than not true, but then I think he also does sort of kind of play up a little bits of some of these. I mean, yes, we know that Chris absolutely detested his high school graduation. That's been well documented. But what isn't necessarily well documented is the fact that he still appreciated that what people tried to do to help him. Like, I can't necessarily remember which of his gal pals was like there to make him feel better after, you know, he just stormed off from getting his graduation degree and stuff. Well, from graduation, stuff like that. But it's still worth noting he must have had some level of like good thoughts about his graduation in some cases. Around the time of discovery by the Encyclopedia Dramatica, Chris was mainly an introvert. He kept to himself and barely spoke to anyone but his sweetheart. He joined most public chats in both text and voice forms only after being goaded by his current sweetheart. Or a troll. It depends on which one at the time. And even in these chats, he didn't converse a lot, and only answered questions directed towards him. Even while playing video games, he mostly stuck to playing single-player games such as God of War, Pokemon, Sonic, and Animal Crossing. Any multiplayer game he did play was mostly with his sweetheart like Little Big Planet and Burnout Paradise. Before his discovery, when he frequented the game place, he mostly kept to himself. Oh, and Megan, and rarely interacted with other people except during card games. Classic Chris would clearly fall on the introvert side of the spectrum, but he isn't a full-on introvert. He did visit an anime expo in 2004 and 2005 respectively. New Chris, however, would easily fall on the extroverted side since round about 2017, as he started publicly responding to people, started playing multiplayer and co-op games such as Tetris 99 and Payday 2. Visited multiple conventions like BronyCon, OmegaCon, BabsCon, and the Too Many Games Expo. He has also started streaming videos and answering questions his fans have. He has also joined public and private Discord groups, though his interaction with other humans in them is limited. On Twitter, he has started interacting, although poorly, to a ton of people ranging from artists to enablers. Kindness and respect. While Chris may strive to be kind, his efforts often fall flat and instead come across as annoying, overwhelming, or creepy. Chris at least shows he makes an effort to look like a kind person. We've went through a number of these before, and it is certainly true, Chris does, but I've kind of always been on the side of, is he doing it for good reasons, that sort of thing. And he has referred to himself as the kind, compassionate Christine Chandler. But saying you're kind and actually being kind are two very different things. Many of Chris's attempts at being kind, from calling complete strangers darling to kissing guys he just met, are a clear violation of others' boundaries and easily make people feel uncomfortable. Ironically, his attempts can be quite unkind, particularly in how forceful they are. To his credit, though, Chris did raise funds for the childhood cancer charities Alex's Lemonade Stand in June 2012, as well as donating to the Red Cross after Hurricane Harvey in September 2017. But that's about as far as it goes for any legitimate kind deeds that don't seem to have any immediate rewards in terms of Chris. You do good deeds because they're the kind thing to do. That's why people do them. Empathy versus empathy. Anger, or tarred rage as the trolls have famously coined it, is a defining feature of Chris's personality. Also notable is his lack of empathy beyond the point where it can be autism related. While autistic people often struggle with cognitive empathy, the ability to know what someone is feeling, they generally have lots of emotional empathy, the ability to feel what someone is feeling after finding out. Chris seems to lack both ignoring others' feelings even after they directly state them. Chris generally utilizes apologies as a performative tool to placate others and to persuade them to either leave him alone or give him what he wants. On the few occasions, Chris does demonstrate what appears to be genuine remorse or grief. He still tends to be either ignore or only broadly address issues at the heart of the matter, or shift blame onto others. And in what is perhaps his most infamous example of a tearful apology, a stroke of blissful happenstance was enough to completely erase any lingering feelings of sorrow that Chris may have had. Indeed, it galvanized him enough that he indirectly mocked the target of his past apologies instead. While Chris is not utterly incapable of feeling empathy, he has repeatedly demonstrated difficulty in constructing meaningful, sincere apologies for his misdeeds. That is, in part, due to his condition, and accordingly, due to how some of his previous statements intended to redress the grievances of others that have been constructed. Having been raised on a steady diet of assorted television programs ever since childhood, and having experienced little in the way of meaningful social interaction ever since his days at Manchester High, Chris seemingly relies on his experience with the media to assist him in many social situations, and apologies are no exception. When Chris attempts to make amends, he often hinders his own efforts with his delivery. His manner of speech is monotonous, I should say, and often without any real emotion in such instances, with him appearing to do his level best to appear dejected and put upon, an illusion that is shattered the moment he asks for a ban to be lifted because he wants to buy things, for instance. When he feels it necessary, he will also score his videos with a background track, a tactic likely employed in this case to get the recipient to feel sorry for him and understand his point of view. This approach is possibly inspired by the media that Chris has consumed. Oh, absolutely. Heartfelt moments call for fitting music, and so he sees it as the right thing to do, rather than an instance of blatant emotional manipulation. The other, more noticeable aspect of this, however, is that on many occasions, Chris displays an apparent inability to understand what he did wrong even after his mistakes explained to him. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the Alec Benson Leary saga, where over the course of a number of telephone conversations, Chris was repeatedly urged to apologize for his actions that were explicitly read out to Chris on 2 separate occasions. The videos that follow these calls, already hampered by his flat, detracted affect, and did not address several of these wrongs. In some cases, they created new ones altogether. And those that were brought up were only spoken of briefly, with an absolute minimum of any emotion. In the 7th call between the two, Alec would directly accuse Chris of not understanding his faults. This eventually culminated in the highly controversial Solitude Issue 10, in which Chris has comic representations of Alec and his friends be brutally murdered by his gaggle of OCs and Solitude clones, while he would later revise the ending of the issue. At the time, he staunchly defended himself, proving that, like with most aspects of social grace, Chris is perfectly willing to renege on past apologies and promises if it benefits him specifically, or to spite others who prove themselves a nuisance to him and his work. In a video published shortly before the comic's release, he backpedaled and claimed that he was taking a stand against Alec and his associates, and that he never wanted to kill Simone the Rosechew, a controversial character cribbed from an OC made by Evan, a friend of Alec's, and categorizing Evan's requests for apology and to stop using his work as blackmail, and in the 9th and final call with Alec, he blatantly backtracked on several phone calls and 2 apology videos worth of statements, admitting to believing that Simona was always his, and when called out on for his execution of the Asperpedia 4, he responded that requesting the death of one of his characters comes with a price. While Chris may be fickle when it comes to apologies and their sincerity, we've covered some of his problems before and all that, and you know what? I think part of the reason why I think they mentioned before is the reason why Chris struggles so hard to actually look authentic and actually regretful whenever he tries to apologize is because deep down he's not really sorry. Not because he doesn't understand why people were angry at him. Well, that's possibly the case. But also, I think Chris absolutely thinks he is 100% in the right in everything he's done. So he's probably left a little bit perplexed about why he has to apologize for things that he thinks he's done okay and right. And he is just so... Wow. It stems from the fact that Chris seems very, very incapable of actually not just receiving criticism, but actually being able to process it. Like, why would anybody have an issue against Chris? That sort of thing. The two most enduring examples of his unyielding scorn are perhaps Mary Lee Walsh and Michael Snyder. The former for the crime of destroying a sign in an effort to stop one of her college's pupils from loitering on school grounds in an attempt to solicit sex from students, was transformed into the first villain of the Solitude comic series, made into a target of ridicule and mockery, and was sent intimidating drawings by Chris. The final straw in a series of missteps that saw him suspended from PVCC entirely for 1 year. Although Chris would later try to change her image within the comics and even consider reconciling with her in reality, going as far as to deliver a framed version of his formal apology to her office himself. It didn't work. Chris still viewed the process of reconciliation through the lens of Chris forgiving Mary for her past misdeeds, and when his attempt at delivering an apology was met with the dean contacting Chris's parents and asking them to ensure Chris remained away from the campus permanently under threat of legal summons, he was swift to do what he always did, labeling her as the architect of all his misery and deserving of whatever ill fortune may befall her. This bitter hatred burned for years after, surfacing most prominently in 2013, in which Chris blamed her and the other parties for his life being the way it was a series of Facebook rants. Mary Lou Walsh retired in 2019, whereupon Chris uncharacteristically wished her a peaceful life until her time of passing, but not without offering constructive criticism on how she could have better spoken to him, as opposed to probably the also many hundreds of students that Mary Lee Walsh had to deal with, and she probably forgot all about Chris only a few days after their incident back in 2003 anyway. Michael Snyder, however, has not been as fortunate by comparison. A constant target of Chris's wrath and a subject of his conspiratorial ramblings, Chris has spread extremely little in the way of pity or understanding for Snyder and his actions. Chris has commonly regarded Snyder as the other architect of all his misery, going as far as to accuse him of being a grasping, conniving shemmer, inexplicably conspiring with the Greene County School Board to ban him from the game place, and claiming that he didn't even know why he had been barred from the store when Snyder himself and accounts of Chris's interactions with Snyder make it clear that Chris's own behaviour was the cause. These feelings of empathy only intensified after the 28th of October 2011, an incident which Chris has come to believe was entirely staged and grossly exaggerated by Snyder. This is the incident in which Bob and Chris ran over Michael Snyder, I should say. Despite Snyder showing remarkably leniency towards both Chris and his mother in the subsequent legal proceedings, monitoring for their state sentences to be reduced to misdemeanors, Chris was not at all humbled by this impossibly gracious act of mercy. He went on to blame Snyder as the root cause for the Chandlers' financial crisis, rather than spending the entirety of Bob's inheritance on an expensive lawyer, and in the years since that his venom has not been abated. In June 2021, A full 13 years after being banned from the premises of a now defunct hobby store, Chris has listed Snyder as being among the most negative influences on his life. This is despite the fact that any influence Snyder had on Chris was in part because of what Chris did, so it seems hardly fair to start going after Snyder when he was only doing his job, enforcing the rules. And even then, Chris seems completely indifferent as to why his actions seem to have impacted on any sort of happenstance or any sort of point of view that any person in authority might have had as to how best to deal with customers who are acting out of order, such as Chris. You may also notice that Chris doesn't list any of the things that he felt he did wrong, especially when it comes to Michael Snyder or the gameplays. Yeah. Openness versus obstinacy. In psychology, openness is a person's receptivity to new or unfamiliar experiences and ideas, including changes. A lot of Chris's closed-mindedness can be attributed to his autism, as autistic people find comfort in predictable routines and are often aversive to changes, both major and minor. It is to be noted that no person is completely open to change, and no person is completely against it. People tend to be open regarding views to things that don't matter to them, and like to remain closed about topics that are close to them. Chris is no exception to this. Chris is not very open to thoughts that differ from his. He rejects opinions and actual scientific facts if they do not match his beliefs. Once again, we go straight to me. It's all about what Chris wants. When he used to hate the LGBT community, he would find any excuse he could to rail against homosexuals, his hatred proving so overwhelming that the mere action of saying the word gay was a task he found discomforting. He had also gone to the point where he rejected the fact that Asperger's syndrome is a form of autism just because he did not like it, perceiving it as not being real autism, and that those who had it were merely trying to take the limelight away from true autistic people. Yeah, I know, it's as stupid as it sounds. After he came out as a transgender, he became much more open to the LGBTQ community, and accepted them as equals. But his obstinacy has merely shifted topics, not changed them. For example, his belief in the dimensional merge remains steadfast, and he is quick to dismiss anyone who tells him otherwise. He openly rejects proof that the merge isn't happening anytime soon, and cherry-picks minor incidents that seem to support his flawed agenda. He is also quick to use his identification as someone within the LGBTQ community as grounds for accusations of discrimination whenever he finds himself prevented from doing what he wants by the powers that be, beyond his ability to influence or bargain with, a position that he is rarely talked down from talking. Similarly, for a number of years, Chris held a potent hatred towards the Xbox line of gaming consoles. Well, he doesn't need to worry about that now, they're sort of slowly dying. His explanations for this empathy were often lacking and occasionally incoherent, but most accounts point to his aversion to the Xbox Live service around the time of the PS3 and Wii's prominence. His explanation then was that the Xbox was a poor investment because its competitors offered free Wi-Fi services, seemingly oblivious to the existence of free accounts that could access most Wi-Fi features outside of online play. However, it should be noted that Chris is very quick to vacillate in this vacillate is that am I pronouncing that right? Vacillate in this regard, especially if he believes there is something in it for him, taking an incredibly rapid about-turn in his behavior to placate others. Later, in a bid to impress Jackie, he would admit that his arguments against Microsoft's machine were born from a lack of experience. He confessed that he had never owned an original Xbox and only ever used to play an Xbox 360 at a booth, twice, and they left him with no leg to stand on. It's almost as if Chris's hatred towards things only stems from the fact that he's never tried them out. How do you know you're going to dislike something if you've never tried it? With Chris divulging that his reason for his hatred of the console was not simply zealous brand loyalty, but him unable to afford an Xbox. So you mean to tell me if Chris actually had money back in the day, he would have just bought an Xbox 360? When he was already flat broke anyway? I don't get it. Being envious of those who had the ability to do so. Despite this, he would later relapse at the height of the latest round of console wars between the PS4 and the Xbox One. But once more he changed his tune, seemingly unprompted. He revealed himself as a gold account owner in November 2017, and since then has not had a single bad word to say about a game console he once despised with remarkable intensity. Hence, this is also a case of Chris demonstrating a bizarre degree of sudden openness towards something he claimed to hate. He has shown identical behaviour towards other things which initially served to arouse his ire, yet eventually came to be counted among his obsessions. Equestria girls, for example, chief among them. With Chris going from hating the very idea of the show in May 2013 to naming the franchise-launching film as his second favourite movie of all time a mere 3 months later. Chris and his personality tests. Being a social media addict who also likes magical thinking, it's no surprise that Chris is a fan of personality tests. He has taken many over the years. Here are a few to them. A Magic the Gathering quiz. To find out what is most like the white colour typing, as each colour associated with certain personality traits, the white type is also associated with law and order, being the good guy beating up the bad guy. This seems to indicate that Chris held to his idealistic views of good and evil, and wasn't being very true and honest in the test, since he is a very anti-law citizen when it stops him from doing what he wants. An A16 personalities test. An online version of the Myers-Briggs test to demonstrate what his MBTI, a Myers-Briggs type indicator, is. He learned his personality type is ENFJ-T. He also did the same for Magi-chan, who is apparently an ENFJ-A. So, ENFJ. So, ENFJ. Caring, enthusiastic, idealistic, organized, diplomatic, responsible, skilled, communications, who value connection with people. You know, that's what Chris may view himself as, but the problem again, ladies and gentlemen, is that you can say you are those things, but there are instances that sort of paint a lot of these things as very shaky, shall we say. Dissociative identity disorder. Due to Chris's more recent behaviours, such as belief in spirit possession and the manifestations of cartoon characters, Chris may indeed now have a mild trauma-induced strain of dissociative personality identity disorder, and a mental disorder categorized by the maintenance of at least 2 distinct and relative enduring personality states. This is most likely connected to manipulation from the idea guys, and other traumas in his youth due to the mistreatment of those with ASD in a clinical and social environment. It is unknown how real the characters are to Chris, but he seems very adamant that they are real and manifest physically. The main indicators of dissociative identity disorder that Chris displays are daydreaming. Chris often mentions daydreaming as a form of meditation, during which Chris can visit Quickville, Chris's imaginary city, where he is the overlord. Imaginary friends. Chris has a belief that all comic book characters are real people, as autonomous as any human being, and that these characters exist in the real world and speak to him in his head. Reality, fantasy, or overlap. Chris not only believes that the fantasy world of cartoons is real, but that one day it will merge with reality, and that already characters like Sonichu, Mewtwo, and Magi-chan have manifested themselves physically. transitional objects itself. Chris is often emotionally attached to himself to objects, resulting in hoarding. But the place in which this behavior is most prevalent is with his character Sonichu. Chris identifies as mother, previously father, of Sonichu, and indeed all Sonichus which result in him being protective of them, making things like putting them in danger in the comics seem immoral to him. Time loss. Due to Chris's reportedly long daydreaming sessions and poor memory associated with them, and his frequent and aggressive habit of lying, it can be suspected this as a result of DID, ability to cut off from pain and awareness of danger. Chris's peculiar approach to emotional pain, namely that he'll randomly cut it off from it totally, can be ascribed partially to ASD. But there is also a chance it is the symptom of some form of DID. Chris will produce very random responses to trolls' efforts to destroy things that are close to him, or to kill those cloned to him, who are close to him, sometimes resulting in Chris showing very little signs to caring in the slightest. I know. After a while, you just sort of begin to realize that, again, Chris is sort of, his lack of actual any cognitive emotion whatsoever can sometimes result in him saying things that you would have to really, really think hard if that's what you want to say. With this evidence, particularly noting the trauma that Chris must have received from the Idea Guy's manipulators, and Chris's current beliefs about the existence of imaginary places and people, and their ability to possess him, one may conclude that Chris having a mild form of dissociative identity disorder is likely. Christian versus Christopher. For 2 days in August 2009, Chris tried to convince Casey and the rest of his fans that he had dissociative identity disorder, a mental disorder categorized by the maintenance of at least 2 distinct and relatively enduring personality states. One of these personalities was named Christopher and the other named Christian, as demonstrated in a video from the time. The video's original subject was quickly derailed by Christopher, Chris's more repressed personality, by interpreting Christian mid-sentence and having a free-flowing sentence with Christian, something which is almost impossible for someone with DID to do, due to usually not sharing memories or servicing at the same time, or people who just make this shit up on the spot because it thinks that's going to make them look funny, clever, interesting. But no. Chris did not end up managing to fool anyone into believing he had the disorder, and Casey reprimanded him for pretending to have DID and lying to her. Chris apologized and said he made it to fuel the trolls, which still leaves one to wonder why he tried to convince Casey that it was true. Yeah, she could see through this like you wouldn't believe, so what can you do? So that's technically... Whoops. That's technically the end of it right there. But what I will say, and something that's pretty like universal sort of when it comes to like Chris's overall personality, is that it's not just, if you were like, I'm not saying you ever should, if you ever like interacted with Chris, the response you're gonna get is gonna be one of 2 things. The first is that without any context, Chris will like exposition dump a lot of things towards you, but would Chris ever do like the same to expect somebody else to talk to them in the way he talks to them? A lot of things that sort of like come like full circle, especially with this article about Chris, is that, and something that's a bit of a not really being talked about in this article, is the fact that, does this make Chris a good person or not? I mean, obviously no. The answer is obviously no. But was he a good person at some point in his life? At what point do you say that maybe Chris, despite all of his problems, despite a slightly rough upbringing, despite his gullibility, his naivete, all the exploits with the trolls, do you think Chris would have been a different person if nothing of like that happened? As like as the meme goes and that, where we talk about Chris, all of this could be avoided if Quiz's art teacher just allowed him to use Sonic the Hedgehog. But whether that is or not, I think we'll just leave well enough alone for now. And I hope you guys have enjoyed this article, and I cannot wait to talk with you guys again in the next video. Take care, and bye-bye for now.